Screens by Terry Lamsley. It's read by John Davitt. Screen. 1. To hide from view as with a screen. 2. To project. A lantern slide, cinematograph picture, etc. OUD. "Of course," said Mrs. Ash, pausing over the task of wrapping his wedge of blue Stilton and leering up at him over her spectacles without rising from her customary stoop. "If you've been abroad over the last few weeks, you won't have heard—" And she let the last word hang in the air like a baited hook. Andrew realised he had set himself up. To pass the time while she encased his cheese in layers of cellophane and paper, and because something about her always made him slightly nervous, he had asked if anything had happened in the village while he had been away, expecting the usual bland response. Instead, he could tell, she had something juicy for a change. Some not very good news he, in particular, was not going to welcome. He wished he had kept quiet. He wanted the conversation to drop, but Mrs. Ash wasn't going to let it. She stood immobile over her task, demanding a response, as though trapped in an enchantment that only a word from him could break. "Heard what?" he said flatly, trying to sound disinterested. Mrs. Ash slipped the cheese into a bag with his other purchases. "About your friend?" she said slyly. "Mrs. Shasta?" Kate Shasta was his next-door neighbour, and his only friend in the village. They occupied 2 tiny detached but adjacent cottages on the edge of Longton, in a position of comparative isolation. Because they were both single, Kate a widow, he divorced, and recent incomers to the community, they spent quite a lot of time together, visiting each other's homes and escorting each other to the local pub. Rumours of a romantic attachment between them had naturally grown and flourished. There was, however, no truth in this. Kate and Andrew were just the good friends of the cliché, and sometimes Andrew wondered if they were even that. The joke between them was that she was too ancient and he was too ugly, and they were doomed to stay single forever. Kate, at 41, was 7 years older than Andrew, whose face had been disfigured slightly in a hang-gliding accident. "Has something happened to Kate?" he said, noting that Mrs. Ash's eyes widened slightly at his use of the Christian name. "Oh, no, duck." She shook her head and showed her dentures behind a cranky smile. "Not as far as we know, but she's been out. We've not seen her about." She raised the bag of shopping from the counter and moved it slightly towards him. "Young Darrell noticed she hadn't used her milk. The pints he delivered for 2 days hadn't been taken in. He told his dad, and Mr. Lomax called at her house. She wasn't dressed, Mr. Lomax said, when she came to the door at 1 in the afternoon, so he knew something was wrong." "What do you mean, she wasn't dressed?" "She was in a dressing gown. Mr. Lomax said her hair was all over her face, as though she'd just got out of bed." Mrs. Ash clearly relished this detail. Kate was fussy about her appearance. Andrew could not imagine her answering the door looking anything but her best. Perhaps she was in trouble. Was she sick? Had she seen a doctor? Mr. Lomax offered to get one, but she wouldn't have it. Said she wasn't ill, and there was nothing wrong. Andrew reached out, removed his groceries from the shopkeeper's weakly grasping hand, and stepped back towards the door. "I'll call round now," he said. "See how she is." "You better add duck," said Mrs. Ash officiously. "I expect you'll be able to sort her out." And she winked at him, as though they were joined together in some naughty complicity. "She'll listen to you," she added. As Andrew went out onto the street, and the brass bell above the door jangled, she called, "Are you back for a while now, Mr. Colvin? Shall I tell Darrell to start delivering your milk again?" "Yes," said Andrew. "Thanks. I won't be going away again for some months." It was when he came back to it after a spell away that Andrew noticed how deserted the village seemed to be, except at weekends when, in all seasons, there were booted tourists trudging their way through from one beauty spot to another. Longton looked an empty, forsaken place. People kept to themselves and their houses to a degree that was downright morbid. Nothing moved for hours on end, and nothing changed except the weather and the gardens, where things sprouted and grew unnoticed for the most part, though they must have been tended by someone, since they were invariably kept in neat, good order. It had been a wet afternoon, and the darkening effect of the damp on the stone walls of the houses gave them a drab, self-effacing uniformity. The sky beyond the not-so-distant horizon was scarred by columns of sooty clouds that seemed to rise up vertically and sweep along behind the crests of the hills, like a line of megaliths on the march. Andrew was startled when a girl of about 14, in a long green coat, her face wedge-shaped in a high turned-up collar, stepped out of a gate and on to the road ahead of him. She had a dog on a lead. She stood and watched without expression as he drove past, leaning back to resist the tug of the big, impatient German shepherd. Andrew saw in the driving mirror that she remained watching his car for some seconds before turning and running off in the opposite direction, and felt obscurely uncomfortable. It was odd how even such a brief and remote encounter with a resident of Longton could make him feel unwelcome. He parked by his front door, unpacked the luggage from the boot, and dropped it in the tiny hall. He took a brief turn around the house to check all was as he had left it, then looked out of his first-floor window at Kate's house, about 20 yards away from his. All seemed normal. There was no milk on the step by the side door, where Darrell, the delivery boy, always put it. The curtains were drawn back, and a fuzz of smoke drifted out of the chimney. Probably old Farmer Lomax was making a lot out of a little, Andrew decided. It was the man's way. For all his size and lumpish manner, he was a gossip at heart, quite capable of embroidering a tiny tale into an epic to amuse himself and entertain his friends, especially if it was about the incomers. Nevertheless, Andrew felt a need to visit Kate, to put his mind at rest. If she had seen or heard him return, she might think it strange if he went round at once, without pausing to wash or eat. So he did those things quickly, making a meal of the Stilton and fresh bread. Then he remembered he had an excuse to call on his neighbour anyway. He had a present for her. Moments later, with a gift in its fancy wrapping under his arm, he tapped on the stained-glassed sunset on her door. She was a long time answering, and opened the door just as he knocked a second time. He saw at once she had been expecting him, was, at the very least, disturbed about something, and was trying to conceal that fact from him. She smiled with her mouth, but her eyes had a different look, suggesting her mind was on whatever it was that troubled her, something serious and mysterious. Her sharp-featured, expressive face always betrayed her thoughts to some extent. She reached up to kiss his forehead. He pecked her cheek in return and handed her the present. She pushed him ahead into the comfortable, over-furnished parlour at the back of the cottage, murmuring what he took to be the usual words of gratitude. After handing him a bottle and a glass, and instructing him to help himself, she unwrapped the gift. Her movements were uncharacteristically violent. She tugged at the tape round the box, without trying to unfasten the simple bow he had tied, and tore at the paper clumsily. She seemed to be trying to regain the self-possession she had unaccountably lost, and to be aware that she was not succeeding. He pointedly looked away from her towards the television. The screen was mostly dark, but formless, off-white, slithering shapes that he could not identify drifted languorously across it from time to time. He couldn't make out what was going on. He leaned forward and squinted. The volume was low. He was unable to understand a word of the whispered commentary. When she saw what he was doing, Kate pointed the remote control at the set and touched a button. The picture shrank and sank. There was a whir and a click, and Andrew realized that he had been watching a video. He turned back to Kate, expecting some explanation as to why she had abruptly censored his viewing, but he did not get one. She glanced at him, and their eyes met. She looked away at once, to the gift on her lap. She praised it hurriedly and overmuch, but without conviction. Words tumbled out of her as though they had been cramped away in some tight place, and were glad to be free at last. Then she suddenly shut up, and looked annoyed with herself. He beamed pleasure in her apparent satisfaction, and poured a drink for himself. He asked if she wanted one, knowing that she hardly ever drank at home or at all. After a brief, frozen pause, when her face opened wide like a window that he could see her thoughts spinning, she nodded emphatically. Surprised, he went to fetch her a glass. In the kitchen, he was brought up short. The room was a mess. Empty cans and packages and half-eaten meals were spread about the work surfaces, and dirty dishes stuck out of the greasy water in the sink. A box of cereal had spilt onto the floor, and its contents crunched and crackled underfoot. The food cupboard doors were open, and the shelves inside were almost empty. After some searching, he found and rinsed a glass, half-filled it with Smirnoff, added a drip of lime, and went and handed it to her. He hoped the spirit might loosen her tongue. As she reached for the drink, she gave him a smile that got strangled at birth and only increased his rising discomfort. "How have things been?" he said. "In Longton, I mean," he added, as she looked at him slightly askance. "Anything interesting happened?" "It never does," she said. "Does it?" "Not when I'm here. Not so far, anyway." She shook her head cynically. "Nothing changes." "You've been keeping okay?" She sipped her vodka, pursed her lips and nodded. "Good," he said, and thought, end of conversation. Christ, have I come to the wrong house? Or is this Kate's dozy twin sister that she's never told me about, and always kept hidden? It was as though she'd fixed a dimmer switch to her personality and turned it to minimum, or taken some numbing narcotic. "That's it," he thought. "Drugs!" He took a good look at what he could see of her eyes, but they were just dull and lifeless, not high and crazy, or pained and anxious from withdrawal. Something seemed to have been taken out of her, not inhaled or injected in. Something was missing. He started to tell her about his time away, to give himself time to think. It had been just another dull business trip to Scandinavia, and he was hard-pressed to come up with something amusing. She smirked at his attempts at wit, and smiled wanly at his trite tales about a lost luggage crisis and the price of restaurant meals in Stockholm. After a few minutes, he gave up. "By the way," he ventured, "is your car running again?" "I had it fixed weeks ago. It's fine. Only I noticed you don't have much food in, so I wondered if you were off the road." She didn't react. He was still waiting for some comment when he suddenly noticed something else. "Where's Bruckner?" he said. The dog usually gave him a warm but dignified welcome, being one of the rare members of its race that was able to exercise self-control when a visitor came through its owner's front door. Now there was no sign of it. "He's gone." She sounded irritable, almost resentful. "He's dead?" "Probably. He just went. I let him out, and he didn't come back." "That's odd." "You looked for him?" "Of course." "You must really miss him." "Yes." "Well, I did at first." She sounded as though she was finding it hard to remember how she had felt about her pet's disappearance. Andrew couldn't believe it. Bruckner and Kate had been very close. She had never been silly about him, or treated him like a surrogate child, and they seemed to have developed a relationship based on respect. Bruckner had a steady nature, though he was prepared to look fierce for strangers when Kate required him to. He'd been a good dog. Now he was gone, and she hardly seemed to care. He noticed her glass was empty. He'd hardly touched his drink. How long had he been holding it? Surely no more than a minute or two. He drained his glass. Perhaps it's me, he thought. Jet lag, stress, something like that. He'd been travelling for almost 24 hours. He didn't feel too bad, a bit bleak and hazy, but not overtired. Still, he didn't trust himself to wrestle with Kate's problems just then. He'd sleep on his impressions, he decided, and consider them again in the morning. When he got up to go, Kate didn't try to detain him, something that, out of affection or politeness, she usually made some small show of doing. As he passed the front of her house, he noticed, behind the net curtain, the glow of her TV set. She must have turned it back on the instant he was out of the room. He remembered the whitest smudges drifting through the cloudy depths of the screen. What had they been? Faces, perhaps, blurred and distorted? Something, anyway, that she had not wanted him to see. He spent the next morning unpacking and freshening up the cottage. Then he drove 7 miles into Buxton to pick up supplies from a supermarket. He thought to ask Kate if she wanted anything, but couldn't bring himself to do so. He had been wondering restlessly about their relationship. He had thought they were, on many levels, quite close, but he had never been sure of Kate's friendship. Frequently, what seemed to be affection on her part had an artificial, warmed-over flavour like fast food. Her amity sometimes had a false edge, but Andrew had not let this bother him. After all, they were neighbours, brought together by chance. On the whole, on the surface, they got on remarkably well. But he was full of mixed feelings about his visit to her the previous evening. On one hand, he had an impression that he may have been treated rather shabbily by her. On the other, he feared that he may have blundered in on Kate when she had been vulnerable and unhappy, and he had not been sensitive enough to appreciate the situation and react accordingly. He shouldn't have rushed around and thrust his gift at her, as though it were an invitation to a party at her place. He should have ignored the siren warnings of trouble-stirring Mrs. Ash and waited for a more appropriate time to visit. His worst fear was that the loss of Bruckner explained Kate's obviously disturbed state, and he'd been crass enough to go on about the bloody dog, probably the one subject she did not want to think about. Still, there was no way he could have known that the creature was dead, and he tried to shrug off the wisps of guilt that lingered on his conscience. He had lunch in Buxton and got back to his cottage just before 3 in the afternoon. He glanced across at Kate's house as he motored up his drive and saw that her curtains were closed. He watched part of the football match on TV, but at half-time couldn't resist going upstairs and looking across at Kate's house. An unclaimed bottle of milk stood by her door. I'm getting worse than Mrs. Ash and the rest of the villagers, he thought. It's none of my business how Kate spends her days. I'm worrying about nothing. I saw her less than a day ago and she was okay. Off colour, perhaps, but aren't we all sometimes? So what if she's tired? If she spends a day in bed? Then an obvious explanation occurred to him. She had a lover. He was in there with her. She's having a wild affair. The possibility made him feel worse than ever about his intrusion. The theory would account for a lot. The disorder in the kitchen, which, on reflection, was merely untidy, no time or energy for housework. Kate's distant, slightly nervous demeanour, and her lack of genuine enthusiasm to see him back. As he half-watched the last of the match, he searched inside himself to see if his speculations engendered any jealousy. They did. Not specifically sexual jealousy, though there was an element of that. More a nagging, resentful envy that was surprisingly painful. He would surely miss Kate's company. But he felt he had been dumped abruptly, unceremoniously. She should have told him, given him some explanation, and not left him to puzzle things out himself. It was shabby. He was surprised at her for acting so covertly, as though she were ashamed. It was just not like her. He wondered what sort of man was capable of causing her to behave so uncharacteristically, and tried to picture him. Then he realized that he had made the whole thing up out of almost nothing. There was not a scrap of real evidence to support his fanciful theory. There were a dozen equally plausible explanations. The football petered out in a draw. The faces of the exhausted, frustrated players as they walked off the pitch brought the afternoon to a depressing anticlimax. Andrew switched off the TV. He put on his boots, Gore-Tex jacket, and waterproof trousers, and went for a long walk in the pouring rain. He got back late. The light was on in Kate's parlour. All looked normal. He peered over the hedge that divided their gardens. The milk had been taken in. I'm an idiot, he thought, and Mrs. Ash is a bloody witch. Sunday started well. He was up early. He made a lot of coffee and drank it slowly as he read the papers, filling his mind with national scandals and despairs that he had missed while abroad. This took him to almost midday, when he had arranged to drive to Ashbourne to visit friends. He was running a bath and pulling the pins out of a new shirt when there was a knock at the door. He thought Kate. He realised that he was unwashed and in his dressing gown, much as Mrs. Ash had said Kate had been when Farmer Lomax had paid her a call. The thought amused him. He would point it out to her. He should have mentioned that Mrs. Ash had spoken to him about her. It would be easy to make a joke of the whole affair, and perhaps clear the air a bit. Andrew found a tired, rather aged policeman standing on his step when he opened his front door. The man stepped forward, took off his helmet awkwardly, and pushed a lick of long, dark hair back over a bald spot with the palm of his free hand. At the same time he said, "Sorry to disturb you on the day of rest, sir, but we're making inquiries about a child who's been missing from her home for 2 nights. You might know her. Linda Morris. The family live at this end of the village." Andrew shook his head. "It's serious," the PC continued. "She took her dog out for exercise Friday evening and didn't come back. The dog turned up at the house last night, badly injured, so we're fearing the worst." "That's terrible." "Yes. Have you seen a child, or anyone unusual about?" Andrew was about to answer in the negative when he remembered the girl with the dog he had seen from his car. "Perhaps," he said. "How was she dressed? Was she wearing a green coat?" "She was. You've seen her." Andrew described the brief encounter while the PC took notes. He was aware that the man was taking in his untidy, unwashed state and watching his face closely. "You didn't by any chance give her a lift, did you, sir?" the policeman asked. "Of course not. Why should I? It was a raw evening last Friday. She didn't need a lift from me or anyone." "You asked her then, sir?" "No." Andrew was beginning to feel the thin edge of anger. "I didn't stop. She looked in no kind of trouble. Anyway, she was with that enormous dog." "Was that the only reason why you didn't offer her a lift, sir? Because of the dog?" "I'm not sure what you're getting at. I've told you what happened, what I saw, which was nothing much." "But you said she was looking at you." "She seemed to be, yes." "That's a bit strange, if you don't know her, isn't it?" "Not really. She probably recognized me." "Why should she?" "I'm an incomer. I've lived here little more than a year. I'm still a stranger." "And very likely you'll always be, sir," the policeman said dourly. "What time would you say you saw the missing girl?" "At about 5:45. "And you went next door to see your neighbour about an hour later?" "That's right." "So, you were on your own during that period?" the policeman stated pointedly. "Correct," Andrew snapped. "And I've been alone since I left my neighbour's house on Friday evening, if it's of any interest." "You stayed in your cottage all that time, did you?" "I shopped in Buxton yesterday morning and went for a walk last night." The policeman looked amazed. "You must be a keen hiker. It were pissing down yesterday evening." "I like walking in the rain," Andrew said, almost petulantly, perhaps because it was a lie. He had not enjoyed the walk at all in any normal sense, and had only persevered with it because of some grim, urgent, masochistic need, the memory of which now embarrassed and disturbed him. The policeman told Andrew he would be required to make a statement. Andrew explained he was going to see some friends. The policeman looked doubtful at this, thought about it, then smiled and said Andrew had been very helpful. He would be contacted later. Meanwhile, if he remembered anything else, however small... The bathwater was chilly when Andrew stepped into it. he poured in more hot. He sat shivering and thinking about what he had said to the policeman. He wished that he had gone straight round to see Kate when he had got home on Friday evening. Because he hadn't done so, and had no alibi for the hour immediately after his return, he knew that the police would look upon him as a suspect. He would be investigated. "But I'm innocent," he thought anxiously, as later he pulled the crisp new shirt down over his cold, damp body. Then, for some reason, he found himself thinking about Kate's absent dog, Bruckner. He got back from Ashbourne at about 9:30, went straight round to Kate's house and rapped on the door. There was a tradition that they went together to the Magnus Arms for the last hour on a Sunday night, and he had decided he was going to try to keep her to it. He would do his best to persuade her if she proved reluctant to go. He had not been able to enjoy his Ashbourne friend's company because his mind had been on Kate, the lost girl, and his interview with the policeman. He had not felt able to discuss anything with his friends, though they had heard on TV that a murder hunt was on for a child who was missing from the village where Andrew lived, and had asked him about it. A feeling of totally unwarranted guilt made him reluctant to relate his slight knowledge of the subject, though his thoughts were of nothing else, except Kate. He decided he needed to talk to her at once. The cottage seemed in darkness as he strode up her drive, but when he was close to the parlour window, he saw the cold glow of the TV behind the curtains. He banged on the door, waited, then banged harder. He stepped back a few paces and saw that the light from the TV was no longer showing. She turned it off. She was in there, knowing he was outside, and she was not going to let him in. He couldn't believe it. He felt a surge of rage, picked up a pebble, tapped loudly on her window and called her name. The house responded with a powerful silence, like an ancient empty ruin, and he felt like a desecrator, a hooligan bent on mischief. His voice sounded wild and peevish. He called again, deliberately deepening his tone. No answer. His anger, with nothing to centre on, seeped away, giving place to confusion and hurt irritation. "Well, sod you too," he muttered, then was ashamed of himself. He strode round the side of the house into the chaotic back garden. He was aware, as he passed, of the squat black shape of his own cottage hanging like a reflection of Kate's on his right. The night was dark, with only a thin shell of moon to light the autumn sky. But his eyes were adjusting well, and he picked his way through the disorder of untrimmed bushes and collapsing outhouses without stumbling. He found at one point that he was walking on loose earth, as though Kate had been doing some digging. If so, it was the first heavy gardening he had ever known her do. Looking round, he could see no sign of life anywhere at the rear of the cottage. Feeling puzzled and let down, he was about to retreat to his own home when he sensed a movement directly behind him, and something pressed hard across his shoulders. Shocked, he leapt forward, turning as he did so. He lost his balance, fell on one knee, but scrambled up quickly, ready to defend himself. Whatever had blundered against him had not been friendly. Then, out of the silhouette of a collapsed greenhouse that sheltered a dim confusion of moon-bathed broken glass, struts of peeling white-painted wood and dark overgrown plant shapes, something rose up and floated towards him. At first, he wondered if he was at the receiving end of an elaborate, foolish joke. He thought someone was waving a shrunken balloon or a partly inflated paper bag at him on the end of a stick. Briefly, the pallid form hovered close in front of him, at a height a little greater than his own. Then he began to get a better idea of what confronted him. He realized that the blunt-ended, ash-grey, slightly luminous shape that seemed to be inspecting him, but that had no eyes, was nothing he could account for. It was outside of his experience. It inspired not just fear, but a sensation of awe, of chilling reverence. The dull, dumb, faceless thing that still seemed to be somehow solemnly regarding him, then drifted backwards with a silky dancing motion, swaying like an enchanted snake. He got the impression that it was hollow, empty, a husk. Its movements had no weight. As it drew away, he saw that the pale blob was a head attached to an impossibly scrawny body, dressed in some kind of loose, dark suit. It stepped carefully back on naked, shriveled, possibly human feet, and edged its way silently down into the ruins of the greenhouse, like a crab tucking itself under weed in a rock pool. When the thing had gone, Andrew remained for some moments, paralysed and hardly breathing, in the position into which he had stumbled when he had first caught sight of it. He was overwhelmingly grateful to it for going away. He had been afraid, when it had been close to him, that his heart had stopped beating, and that he had pitched into some afterlife from which there was no escape. Moments later, when he could think more freely, he realized that, though the thing had retreated into the greenhouse, it had risen out of the freshly dug earth that he had walked over seconds before it had appeared. He had disturbed it. It had come out to find out who or what he was. And now it knew. He was not aware of returning to his own cottage, but half an hour later he was in his tiny kitchen when the phone rang. It was the police wanting his statement. A car with a flashing light came to drive him to Buxton. He thought, "They don't trust me to drive there myself. Why not?" In a bleak room at the police station, he was asked a lot more questions. Hard questions. Some of them he couldn't understand. He was confused. The thing he had seen hung in his mind. As earlier, it had hovered close to his face, disturbing his thoughts. He had an urge to mention it, but dared not to do so. His hands were trembling when he was asked to sign his statement. The pen shook. 3 policemen watched him without pity, their critical faces expressing a mixture of unfriendly emotions. He was returned home in silence, alone in the back of a car. The driver sniffed from time to time and half turned his head, as though he detected a nasty odour somewhere behind him. He didn't answer when Andrew wished him good night. Andrew had been awake for hours when his alarm went off at 7 next morning. He had decided to go to his office early, to throw himself into the backlog of work he expected to find there. He felt awful, drained and anxious. He made coffee, and he found he had no milk. He couldn't drink coffee black. Darrell, the milkman, delivered to the cottage at 7:25 every morning precisely. A minute after that time, Andrew opened his side door and reached down in the dark for his bottle. It wasn't there. Then he remembered he had heard no bottles clinking. Darrell was a punctual boy, but clumsy and noisy. He was late. As he retreated back through the door, Andrew noticed a dim light from Kate's house opposite. He peered over the scruffy hedge that divided their gardens. The door corresponding to the one he was standing in was open. A figure stood there with its back to Andrew. Its arms were flung wide, as though it had been crucified against the wall on either side above the door. The two hands remained fixed in place, but the body writhed and reached back as though it was trying to withdraw from a source of pain. Andrew recognized at once that the figure dressed in a blue nylon jacket and trousers was Darrell. Just beyond the boy, inches from him, he could see someone else facing him. Kate. She was holding her hands up on either side of her face, her fingers outstretched. Her head was tilted back. Her eyes, as far as he could tell, were shut, but her mouth was open wide, as though she were screaming. She was quite silent. Behind her, in the dark, and obscured by the two closer figures, stood someone else. Andrew could see no details, but he thought it was male. As he watched, the man seemed to reach round the right side of Kate and stab at Darrell's chest. Andrew thought he saw the glint of glass or a knife. Darrell's back convulsed, and Kate brought her hands together on the boy's face, as though to smother or silence him. Nevertheless, Darrell made a terrible sound. He sank away from Kate, who let go of his head, bent down, and appeared to kiss his chest. It was a long, lover's kiss. It was audible to Andrew, sickeningly so. Darrell was handicapped. At 18, he had a mental age of 8. He had been born badly. His body was unsymmetrical. He walked with a jolting, ungainly stride. His head was huge and lolled from side to side. Kate had always liked him. She enjoyed his simplicity and his odd, childish sense of fun. She thought his father treated him harshly, so she made a fuss of him on his birthdays and at Christmas, giving him generous tips. She had been sisterly and kind towards him. Nothing more, nothing else. Now she suddenly drew back from the boy's chest, as though the man behind had wrenched her away. She retreated quickly into the cottage, sliding along the wall to allow the other past to take her place. She left a smear of something along the wallpaper. Briefly, Andrew got a glimpse of the third member of the group. He recognized the long, almost tubular bare oval of a head, and the sharp yet sinuous movements as those of the being he had encountered the previous evening. But it had changed. It now had a mouth, and two livid eyes glared out of bluish patches above a sharp, canine nose. Andrew knew it had seen him. He felt the thing's eyes lock onto his own for one terrible second. The face seemed to sneer at him. It tipped contemptuously back and remained poised in that position for a moment. Then the wide-stretched jaws lunged down on Darrell's shoulder. The boy jerked as though he had been kicked, and howled softly, piteously. Andrew jumped back into the house. He pushed the glass and plywood door away from him into its frame, slowly, as though it were huge and heavy, as though by doing so he was protecting and distancing himself from all he had seen. He stumbled round the house in the almost dark, like a thief searching for a way out. He tripped over a coffee table, tipping the things he had prepared for breakfast across the floor, and fell on the resulting mess. Uncomfortable as he was, he wanted to lie there for the rest of the day, but his curiosity wouldn't let him. It drove him to a window overlooking Kate's house, where he stood and gazed across at the open door, fascinated but horrified, and hoping he could not be seen. As Andrew watched, Darrell broke free or was released. He seemed to almost bounce away. Unable to run, he seesawed from side to side, wildly trying to make haste on his unequal legs. There were bloodstains on his shirt emanating from above his heart, where there was a darker patch like an open wound. As Darrell disappeared down Kate's front path, the lights in her cottage went out, and the side door closed. Andrew watched for a while, but nothing more happened. He worried frantically about Darrell, and would have gone out to him, but he was worried even more about Kate. He was also aghast at the scene he had witnessed, and was limp with fear and incredulity. He leaned against the wall by the window with his eyes shut, trying to make sense of it all for perhaps an hour. Then sat on the floor, hugging his knees for as long again. Then he called his office and told them he was sick. Just before midday, he had a further visit from the police. It was the constable who had first called, this time with a WPC for company. They explained that the lost child had still not been found, and that they were searching all the houses and outbuildings in the area. The policeman was even less friendly than before, Andrew thought, realizing that yet again he was unshaven and in his dressing gown, and must be creating an odd impression. The WPC was nicer, but unnerving. She kept staring at a point above his nose as she spoke, shaking her head slightly and slowly, as though reading words printed on his forehead. He told them to search where they liked, and wandered out into his garden. He tried to see over into Kate's, looking for the newly dug patch, but everything was too overgrown. He could see nothing but unpruned roses choking in a jungle of giant, gone-to-seed weeds. On returning to the house, he found his visitors had switched on his television. The screen was a jitter of static fuzz. The WPC was fiddling buttons, trying to get a picture. She explained that they wanted the news, as they might be on it. They had been filmed earlier searching local fields. Andrew was gratified to see she was pink with embarrassment as she moved aside to make room for him. "Something wrong with the set?" she asked. Andrew shook his head. "You must have pushed the wrong button." "I don't think so," she insisted. "Mine's the same model." Andrew made no comment. The set was acting strange. No picture on any channel, and he couldn't get more than a whisper on the sound. Irritated, he pushed buttons at random. The screen went milky, then filled with monochromatic swirling eddies, like simmering oil. Dim shapes rose out of this slick. One of them reached up and grew big, like a deep-sea creature approaching and peering into a diver's helmet. It almost filled the screen. To Andrew, it resembled a bare, bald head, encased in tight, opal flesh that looked ready to split and peel. Its mouth was a pale, straight gash. It had sharp eyes like black diamonds that seemed to be searching for something or someone out beyond the screen. Andrew thought he knew what it was and who it was looking for. He swore and switched off the set with an angry motion. "You were getting something, then?" the policeman said, apparently undisturbed by the images he had seen. "Not the news," Andrew snapped. "You should have stayed with it," the WPC protested. "It'll be on in a moment." "I don't think so." Andrew slipped the remote control into the pocket of his dressing gown. The woman looked cross and disappointed. "You're right," Andrew said. "It's not working properly. It needs fixing." The policeman watched him curiously, as though he suspected he was drunk or crazy and might shortly need restraining. Andrew scratched the scar tissue left by the hang-gliding injury on the side of his face. It itched when he was stressed or nervous. It was not a pleasant action to watch, as it made one side of his face look like Lon Chaney in profile, the Phantom of the Opera. The WPC stopped reading the lines of his forehead and looked away. Perhaps to change the subject, or to distract herself, she said, "That was a terrible accident this morning. The boy was badly injured. He may not survive." Andrew gaped. "What accident? What boy?" "The delivery boy. He drove his milk float into a lorry, head on. He's in intensive care." Andrew felt himself swaying. "Darrell, the milk boy. That's him." Andrew dropped into a chair, his face white, and slapped his brow like a ham actor. He felt the two pair of eyes watching him closely, and realised the constables must think he was wildly overacting. "Friend of yours, was he?" the man asked, with a hint of sympathy. "No," Andrew said sharply, rejecting the idea. Then, shaking his head confusedly, "Not really. But I knew him, of course." "Lots of things happening in Longton all of a sudden," the man observed. "Strange, isn't it?" Satisfied that they had made a thorough search of the cottage, the two constables went into Andrew's long back garden and began stalking carefully through it. It was not nearly as chaotic as his neighbour's, but weeds had begun to take over during his absence. They'd spent 5 minutes poking about there when they were suddenly called away. They seemed reluctant to go, and promised to return later that day with lights if necessary, as it would soon start to get dark. As soon as they were out of sight, Andrew went and banged on Kate's doors. There was no response. He leaned on the side door, then hit it with his knee just below the lock. It gave a bit, but not enough. He went home, found a large screwdriver, and attacked the door with that. He chipped away at the wood and kicked it viciously. It slammed back against an inner wall. The first thing Andrew noticed as he stepped inside was the long red smudge along the opposite wall, like the path of a bloody comet that he had seen Kate make that morning. He edged into the silent house and called Kate's name. There was no reply, but the beams over his head creaked once, as though something on the first floor had shifted weight. He went into the parlour and found Kate in the same seat she had occupied when he had last spoken to her, nearly 70 hours ago. The lower half of her body was covered with a blanket that she clutched with both thin hands above her stomach, in a frail, old womanish gesture. She was watching the TV. On screen, the pallid, washed-out, floating shapes he was familiar with drifted in and out of a background of metamorphosing grey masses to an accompaniment of small, almost inaudible sounds. Kate started to move as he entered the room. She lifted and turned her head slowly, as though it weighed heavy. She nodded blankly at him, accepting rather than greeting him, and watched as he drew a chair closer to hers. He couldn't help staring at her. She looked terribly frail. Her frizzy blonde hair was a mess. She had aged years. Her half-closed eyes were dull, even against the smudges of bruised skin on her upper cheeks. Her face, always thin, was now sharply bony. Her lips were almost invisible, and her nostrils wide and dark. Andrew thought again of drugs, then dismissed the idea, knowing her problems were worse than that. She said something, probably his name, then coughed to clear her throat. He said hello, his voice faltering. "You shouldn't be here," she stated wearily. "Be careful. For now, he needs you. But you're next." Andrew's brow creased uncomprehendingly. "What do you mean, Kate?" he asked gently, and leaned out of his seat towards her. She shook her head fretfully, said, "It's probably too late, there's nothing you can do," and turned her face back to the TV screen, as though no further explanation were necessary or possible. Andrew followed her gaze for a while, then said, "What is this that you're watching, Kate?" "A video. It belonged to my husband. I found it, and others like it, among some of his belongings a few weeks ago. I thought I had destroyed everything of his," she added, with a whining note of anger, "but somehow a few things survived. They always do. I should have known." "What's it about?" Andrew insisted. "What does it represent?" Kate's razor-thin lips stretched, perhaps in a smile. "It represents my husband," she said. "It's a film that was made just before he died, over 3 years ago. He went away for a while and returned with this, and other things. You could say it was his holiday snapshots, something like that." "I don't understand you, Kate," Andrew said uneasily, not sure if she was intending to be humorous. She turned to him again, her head moving with greater ease now. "Don't you?" she said. "Are you sure? When I first found the videos, he was alive then, and I watched them without telling him. I understood them at once. Mind you, I had some reason to suspect." Andrew waited for her to continue. Then, when she didn't, said, "I'm getting those pictures, or something like them, on my set. I know it's not possible, but I am." "Then he's got to you," she said. "I was right. It is too late." "For what? And who's he?" "Don't pretend," Kate said, almost scornfully. "I know you were watching from your door this morning when there was an incident. So does he, and he won't forget." She became rigid in her chair, with her eyes half closed and an intense expression on her face, as though she were reviewing or reliving the grotesque events he had witnessed. "You never told me much about your husband," Andrew observed. after a period of strained silence. Just that he was dead. Oh, yes. He died at last. There's no doubt about that. I know he was dead. I made sure of it. How did he die? Violently. Very violently. He was a powerful man. It took a lot to kill him. I learned that lesson a few weeks before his life finally ended. He seemed to have died then, but I was wrong. Somehow he survived and came back for me. You mean to you? I mean what I say, she insisted. Anyway, I eluded him then. I escaped. He didn't get me. He died. Undoubtedly he died. And I thought I was free of him. The trouble is, she said bitterly, I'd locked him up, but I forgot to throw away the key. She clutched with both hands at the arm of the chair as though to lift herself, but failed to rise up. Andrew wondered if she had the strength to get to her feet. He thought not. He stood up himself, and without asking, poured 2 big drinks. Kate took the one he offered without comment. She drank half at once. He drank all of his. He said, the police are searching the area for a girl who's gone missing. They're looking everywhere. They've been through my house and almost finished my garden. They'll come to you next. I wanted to warn you. She shrugged. They came before to ask me questions. They could see me through the window. I think they thought that I was dead. I had to let them in, or they would have knocked the door in, as you have done. But I had nothing to tell them. I know nothing about a lost girl. No, perhaps not, Andrew said uncertainly. But is there anyone else here and with you now? Kath's eyes automatically flickered up towards the ceiling. If the police do come and insist on searching the house, then they will have to deal with whatever they find in their own way, if they can. It could be interesting. Interesting? Christ! I can't believe you can be so indifferent to your situation, Kate, Andrew said impatiently. The boy who was involved in your incident was in a serious accident immediately after he left here. Our houses are the last on the edge of the village, and yours was the last delivery he made. The police are bound to question you about him, as a matter of course. You can't say you don't know about that. You're wrong, Kate replied shortly. I know nothing about the accident. It's the first I've heard of it. Andrew noticed she expressed no anxiety about Darrell or his condition, and felt a stab of repugnance that made him wonder if he was beginning to hate her. He remembered her indifference to the loss of Bruckner, her dog. That was bad, but Bruckner was only a pet. Darrell was a friend who was probably going to die, and Kate seemed unmoved. She didn't even seem to find it interesting. On the floor above, something stirred. There were heavy footfalls, and a long scraping sound, as though a weighty object were being shoved into place. Perhaps it's barricading itself in, Andrew thought, with no inclination to go and investigate the truth of his speculation. Kate ignored or did not notice the noises. Andrew was worried that the police would be returning soon. He did not want to be with Kate when they did. He was not quite sure what he thought they would find, but, whatever it was, he did not want to be associated with it or with Kate. She must have detected his anxiety to get away, because she said, "You may as well leave. There's nothing you can do to help." "But are you sure? What will you do?" She shook her head slightly, a tiny movement. "Nothing much. I'm very tired. I shall probably sleep. I'll call round tomorrow to see how you are, he said dutifully. No, you won't, she murmured, sinking deeper into her chair. Don't bother. I'll come to you when I'm ready. That may not be for some time, but I will come. Her voice was so low it was almost inaudible. As he left the room, he thought he heard her say, as she tumbled into sleep, "Don't forget, I told you. You're next." He didn't like it, because he didn't understand it. But it sounded like a threat. The police returned half an hour later. Lots of them. Andrew stood at the back of his home in the autumn twilight and watched as they combed through his garden, finding nothing. They marched next door to Kate's cottage. They got no answer from the front, then found that the side door had been forced. They got quite excited about this discovery. A small but senior-looking man, an officer in a flat hat, was instantly called up from somewhere. He took charge. He carefully pushed the door open and took half a step inside. There was a vivid flash, bright as lightning, that hurt Andrew's eyes, blinding him for seconds. When he could see again, the air was full of tiny fragments of black ash and the smell of burning. The officer who had tried to enter the building was screaming. The front of his body looked like burnt toast. His face had turned to cinders that were beginning to ooze blood. Two other men who had been close behind him were writhing on the ground, similarly injured. Andrew noticed that there was no fire raging and no smoke. He ran through the hedge into Kate's garden, shouting that she was in the building. As he got near, he could see through the open door. She could not have survived. The inside of the house looked as though someone had gone through it with a flamethrower. Nothing had moved, but the surface of everything had been charred black by a flash fire of intense heat. A policewoman ordered Andrew back into his house. Someone shouted to him to call the fire brigade, which he did, though there was no fire to put out. He spent a confused hour with people running in and out of his house. Kate's house was searched when it was declared safe. 2 corpses were found. Kate was dead in her chair. The second was discovered in an upper room. From snatches of half-heard conversation, Andrew got the impression that there was something strange about it, something that disturbed and disgusted those who came across it. Then the plot of freshly dug earth at the rear of Kate's cottage was spotted, sparking off another round of activity. Men started digging down into it carefully with spades. Something was dug out and taken away. Lights were brought from somewhere, and the site was hidden away behind walls of thick plastic sheeting. Later, other, bigger finds were made. At first, the police merely put out the information that Kate had died in a gas explosion. Later, when they revealed what they had discovered in her garden, this explanation was widely questioned, but no more satisfactory cause for the gutting of the cottage was forthcoming, though it was assumed that she and the other person had committed suicide. The contents of the pit, that turned out to have been a grave, were, first, not far beneath the surface, the remains of part of a large dog, later more or less identified as Bruckner, Kate's lost pet. It had been there some weeks. Its head and heart were missing and were never found. 5 feet below Bruckner was the body of a young girl. She was lying face down, and was fully dressed. There were tooth marks and a deep wound above her left breast. Her green coat and her blouse and sweater were torn above this injury, as though someone or thing had bitten right through them. The injury was not the cause of her death. She had suffocated. Her mouth and throat were full of dirt, as though she had somehow died down there, under the earth. It was what was found under her that totally mystified everyone, with the single exception of Andrew. This was the corpse of a man who had been dead for 3 or more years. He was lying on his back below the girl, and most strangely had his arms around her back, as though he were hugging her, or so the men who did the digging insisted, though few believed them. But the most singular thing of all was the fact that the male corpse was headless. The head was found between the man's feet. It had been buried in a crudely constructed wooden box that was a tight fit. 24 8-inch nails had been driven through the box into the skull on all 6 sides, creating quite a puzzle for the police surgeon whose task it was to sort the whole thing out. But sort it out he did. He was even able to identify the corpse. It was Kate's husband, a man who, it transpired, the police had been wanting to question about a number of murders and the mysterious disappearances at the time of his disappearance, at what was now understood to be also the time of his death. As soon as he was able to do so, Andrew went abroad for 6 weeks, to get away from the press and the police. His time of absence from Longton did not do him much good. He hated the place when he returned, and decided to move out as soon as he could. On his first day back, he wandered into the Magnus Arms at lunchtime, in the hope of learning what had happened while he had been away. People were not particularly friendly towards him, but then they never had been. They were noticeably reluctant to talk to him, even when he bought them drinks. Nevertheless, he realized that the village had quickly settled back into its normal somnolence. He drank too much in the pub, and tottered home with a couple of cans of lager, intending to watch football on TV. He had not turned the set on since before Kate's death, and had forgotten that it had seemed to have something wrong with it. He opened a can, slumped into his chair, and thumbed the remote. The screen filled with ugly, oily, swirling shapes, familiar shapes. They filled him with dread. He swore at them. Feeling his flesh creep, he lurched towards the TV and tried to turn it off. He hit the off switch, but nothing happened. The pictures wouldn't go away. The shapes seemed to get clearer and more active, if anything. Kneeling down with his face close to the set, he could clearly hear the soft sounds that it was making. He put his ear close to the speaker and listened, trying to make sense of the nagging noises. After a while, he thought he could. Just. Under the babble and clatter, he could hear another sound that reoccurred from time to time. It was a human voice. A woman's voice. It was Kate's voice, and she was repeating the same 2 words over and over again. You're next. You're next. You're next. He got very frightened then. He went to the wall and pulled the TV plug out of its socket. Again, nothing happened. The picture didn't waver. The sounds got even louder. Then he made a big mistake. He kicked the screen. It collapsed into fragments, releasing all that was inside of it, all the things that had come across to him from Kate's house the moment it had burned, and had been impatiently waiting for him to return to free them. They swirled around him triumphantly, terrifyingly. He saw Kate and her husband among them. The man smiled. Kate smiled. She held out her arms to Andrew. "You're next," she said. And he believed her.